Well, hi there. Welcome to week 3. We should be getting into the routine of things in this course a little bit. But of course, keep me posted if there's anything I can be doing to help. So, this week we're going to be talking about permissions. So, that's permissions and copyright. So, both intellectual property permissions and ethical permissions. We're going to talk about both of those things. We're going to hit some basic copyright information, fair use, which is a concept that we talk about a lot in the library world, and a couple of other things that have to do with permissions. So, first of all, I need to tell you this is like a pretty important foundational concept here, the permissions versus copyright. So, there are intellectual property rights that are guaranteed by copyright laws and regulations in this country, which we'll go through in a minute. But just because the law says you can digitize and share something doesn't always mean you should. A key example here is any materials that depict culturally sensitive content, such as Indigenous people or ceremonies, which we'll also talk about in just a moment, but just to lay a foundation here. So you might be within your legal rights to digitize and share such images, but I want you to consider, is that in the best interest of the people who are depicted and the best interest of your organization? Thinking back to last week's topic, if your question is why are you digitizing this material and for whom, does the digitization of materials that might have sensitive content, does that serve your why? Is it necessary? I'm also going to say here, and this will give you some idea of how I teach this content. I'm also going to assert that when we are doing digitization projects, I believe we should err on the side of what the least powerful party in the situation would like to do. The institutions that many of us work for have lots of societal power, libraries, archives, historical societies. And just by the fact that those institutions are doing digitization projects usually means that those institutions have the resources and therefore the power in this equation. We could talk about this for weeks and weeks and weeks. There's years of uh, content on this topic that we could talk about, the colonial nature and white supremacist nature of institutions. But just here on a really basic level about permissions. If you think about the institution that you are doing digitization for, if this is an institutional project, um, the what I believe the most ethical thing to do is, and frankly, that which will help you avoid the most potential problems later, is to operate in the best interest of the person or the group with the least amount of power. So let's get into the specifics of what that means. We're going to do a little bit of copyright 101 first. And of course, here is the super important disclaimer that I am not a lawyer. I assume most of you are not lawyers. And this is the barest introduction to copyright information as it pertains specifically to digitization projects. So, just like many topics in this course, please know that you would need to do much more in depth research on very specific items for your own digitization project. As with every unit in the course, you're basically getting enough now to know at least what questions to ask in the future. So, number one, owning a physical item is not the same as owning the copyright for that item. We're going to talk about that a little bit more in just a moment, but just to repeat it, owning a physical item is not the same thing as owning the copyright for that item. Number two, not everything in your collections is going to be covered by copyright. And in fact, more materials may be out of copyright than you might expect. So I'll go over a few steps for how to figure that out. And then number three, understanding these copyright basics is not only important for you as a representative of, your archive, local historical society, museum, library, it's also important for your community members because knowing the copyright status of an item helps users determine what they can and cannot do with your content. Can they make their own copy? Can they add things to that copy? So, as your organization determines the copyright status of items in your collection, it's important to share that information with your audiences so that they are able to use your content responsibly. So, who owns the copyright to my stuff? Here's a little kind of basic copyright 101 information. Typically, the copyright belongs to the creator of a work. So, that's the author, the photographer, the artist. Then there are times when people produce things as part of their job, and this is called work made for hire. And in those situations, the copyright belongs to an employer. A good example would be a campus photographer, where the copyright to the photos would belong to the college or university that hired that photographer. A big thing to remember here is that the ownership of copyright stays with the copyright holder until the copyright expires or is legally transferred. So, what that means is that just because someone owns something does not mean that they own or can transfer the underlying copyright. Say a donor has gifted you a Picasso painting. Unless they have a written transfer of copyright from the Picasso estate, the donor doesn't have copyrights that they can transfer to you. They can only transfer the physical ownership of the painting. Relatedly, keep in mind that scanning or digitizing an item does not create a new copyright. So, if the donor gives you a Picasso painting and your organization makes a digital copy of that painting, you don't get to say that your organization now holds the rights to that digital copy. The digital copy has the same copyright status as the original item. If this is starting to sound overwhelming, confusing, bureaucratic, it totally is. You are not wrong about that. I'm going to give you a couple tools for how to work through this, but everybody finds this frustrating. So if you find it frustrating, you are not alone. So we said that in copyright, the copyright in most cases is held by the original creator. But there are many, many cases where no one owns the copyright because the copyright term has expired or it was never copyrighted in the first place. So essentially, anything that is not covered by copyright is considered to be, quote unquote, in the public domain. Works in the public domain may be used without getting permission or attributing the source. That means you shouldn't be concerned about copyright risk when you're digitizing materials that you can identify as in the public domain. It also means, though, that once you put public domain items online, users don't have to ask for your permission or attribute to your institution when they use the content. It is considered good practice to attribute the source of public domain materials, but be aware that it's not required. To figure out whether an item is in the public domain or not, you'll need to know whether the item was considered published or unpublished, and if possible, the date that it was created. Excuse me. So, in the Digital Readiness Toolkit section, there are some tables that tell you the specifics about dates and how they differ for published versus unpublished works, as well as definitions of what published and unpublished means. You'll also see in the toolkit, and I'm going to point it out here, I highly recommend checking out this Copyright Genie from the American Library Association to help with these questions. Of course, with the disclaimer that that is also not legal advice, but it can at least give you information on how to make an informed decision about the copyright status of items. With that, I'm going to pause this first video and make a second video for the second half of this week's lecture materials. See you over there.